All day on November 7, American and British radio stations kept saying, "Robert is arriving. Robert is coming." Hearing this news, I no longer doubted that Robert Murphy's name was nothing more than a symbol. By this signal, America was making herself known to the French of Africa, on whom she hoped to rely. Consequently, the landing was beginning, and it did indeed begin, as we learned the next morning. In the afternoon, at Churchill's request, I went to see him in Downing Street. Eden was also at his house. During our conversation, the Prime Minister did not skimp on expressions of friendly feelings, not hiding at the same time his embarrassment. He told me that the British Navy and aviation in the upcoming operation is an important role, but the British ground troops were involved in it only as a supporting force. At this point, Britain had to accept that all responsibility remained with the United States. Eisenhower was in command, and the Americans demanded that the Free French be removed. "We are forced to go through this," Churchill declared. "However, you can be sure that we are not abandoning our agreements with you. After all, it was to you that we pledged our support back in June 1940. No matter what incidents occur, we intend to continue what we have started. However, as events unfold, we, the British, will have to step in. Then we will say our word, a word in your favour." And Churchill added, not without some excitement, "You were with us in the most difficult moments of the war. Now that the horizon is beginning to clear, we will not abandon you." Both ministers informed me that the Americans are landing simultaneously at several points in Morocco, as well as in Oran and Algeria. The operation is not going smoothly, especially at Casablanca, where French troops are putting up stubborn resistance. General Giraud in the area of the Côte d'Azur received in the open sea British submarine and brought to Gibraltar. The Americans expected that he will be able to take command of the French troops in North Africa and decisively change the situation. But doubts now appeared as to his success. "Did you know," Churchill asked, "that Darlan is in Algeria?" After listening to the explanations of my interlocutors, I answered them in the main as follows. "The fact that the Americans have landed in Africa, where you, the British, and we, the Free French, have been fighting for more than 2 years now, is in itself very gratifying. Moreover, this action, in my opinion, gives France an opportunity to rebuild an army, and also a navy that will fight for the liberation of the country. General Giraud is a true soldier. I wish him success from the bottom of my heart. It is only a pity that the Allies have dissuaded him from entering into an agreement with me, or I could have helped him not only by wishing him success. But sooner or later he and I will come to an agreement, and the less the Allies interfere, the sooner it will happen. As for the operation now undertaken, I am not at all surprised that it is fraught with difficulties. In Algeria, and in Morocco as well, there are many military units that fought against us in Syria last year, and that you, contrary to my prejudices, allowed to leave there. On the other hand, it suited the Americans to hold the hand of Vichy against de Gaulle in North Africa. I always believed that sooner or later they would have to pay the price. Here they are paying the price, and it goes without saying that we French have to pay the price too. However, considering the sentiments that inspire our soldiers, I believe that the fight will not be too long. But however short it may be, the Germans will come up. I express my surprise to Churchill and Eden by the fact that the Allied plans do not take into account primarily Bizerte. For it is quite obvious that the Germans and Italians will invade Tunisia through this port, since the Americans did not want to risk and directly land in Bizerte. It would be possible, if I was asked to do so, to land there a division of Koenig. The British ministers agree with me, but reiterate that the Americans are fully responsible for the operation. That's what I do not understand. I say to them, how is it that you, the British, entirely and completely put in the wrong hands of the enterprise, in the success of which Europe is primarily interested in the success? Churchill asks me how I think the relations between fighting France and the North African authorities will develop in the future. I reply that I think the only possible way is to seek unity. That means that ties must be established as soon as possible. It also means that the regime now existing in Algeria and the prominent figures of Vichy must be removed from the scene, for the resistance, the whole of the resistance, will not allow them to remain. If, say, Darlan were to rule North Africa, the desired agreement could never be reached. Whatever it is, I conclude, the most important thing now is to get the fighting to stop, and then we'll see. That evening, addressing commanders, soldiers, sailors, airmen, officials, French colonists in North Africa, I called out, Rise up. Help our allies. Join them without reservations. Don't think of names or formulas. Let's do it. The great moment has come. The hour of prudence and courage has arrived. Frenchmen of North Africa, with your help we shall again engage from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, and victory will be won through France. In reality, however, according to reports at Carlton Gardens, the Americans were still encountering serious resistance everywhere. No doubt, the connections they had secured for themselves here in advance had played their part. General Mast, commanding the Algerian division, and General Montserrat, commanding the troops in the Blida area, as well as Colonel Jews, Barriel, Chrétien, Captain Second Rank Barjot, and others, assisted them as far as possible for several hours, but at Casablanca General Bethuat tried in vain to do the same. It is true that groups of Gaullists, acting under the command of Pauphilet, Wannick, Ashari, and Ekere, Abalqua, Calvet, and Pillefort, and Dreyfus, the latter having fallen on the field of battle, succeeded in occupying for a time several government buildings in Algiers, and even kept Admiral Darlan under siege all night at the Villa Olivia. It is true that some of the well-known persons, notably Rigaud, Lemigre du Bruel, and Saint Ardouin, who were doing business with the Americans, played the part there which was intended for them by the line of information and communication. And finally, it goes without saying that Giraud's proclamation, where he does not even mention France fighting, is widely disseminated by radio and American leaflets, and loyal officers and resistance members of all persuasions are preparing a command post for him in Darmahedin. But by and large it is clear that the plan devised by Lehigh, Murphy, and Clark, by which the Allied landing was to take place without a single shot being fired, and Roosevelt's message to Pétain, Nogues, and Estevie had not produced the desired result. On November 9, the situation was by no means brilliant. The Vichy authorities either maintained everywhere the advantage or gained the upper hand. Marshall gave direct orders to repel the attack. General Giraud, realizing that the Allies do not intend to go under his command, remained in Gibraltar and still did not appear in North Africa, where, incidentally, his appeal has not had the slightest success. In Algiers, Darlan, although immediately ordered the garrison to cease fire, still allowed everywhere to carry out the plan of defence, and on any occasion still refer to Pétain and Laval. There was fierce fighting in Oran. However, especially fierce battles were played out in Morocco. Casablanca, Port Lyautey, Fidela became the scene of hard fighting, and finally in Tunisia landed an airplane with Admiral Plato, delivered from Vichy Order Admiral Esteve, the chief resident, and Admiral Derrien, naval prefect of Bizerte, to open the passage of the Germans. And indeed, during the same day, the Germans landed a parachute landing in the territory of El Aoun without firing a single shot. That evening the Allies in London had a sour look on their faces. Everyone involuntarily wondered whether the venture would not lead to a long struggle between the French troops and parts of Eisenhower and the invasion of the entire territory of North Africa of enemy troops, which willy-nilly joined the Spaniards. But there, on the spot, common sense prevailed. General Juin, who had been commander-in-chief before Darlan's arrival in North Africa and became second in command after his arrival, quite sensibly appreciated the absurdity of fighting with the Allies and realized what dire consequences would entail the invasion of the Germans and Italians. He also knew that his subordinates deep down held the same opinion. He began to hurry Darlan to sign an order for a general ceasefire, which the latter decided to do on November 10. General Juin made contact with Giraud, who eventually did arrive at Darmahedin. At a reception at the Villa Olivia, Juin indicated to Giraud that he was prepared to yield his seat to him. He gave General Barre, who commanded the troops in Tunisia, orders to group his forces in the area of Medjez el Bab and attempt to open fire on the Germans. On the morning of November 11, fighting between the French and the Allies was ended everywhere. But it had come at a cost. On the French side, 3,000 men were killed and wounded. As for the fleet, many ships were sunk or suffered irreparable damage. Cruiser Primoge, destroyers Albatros, Epavir, Milan, 7 destroyers, 10 submarines, a large number of small ships, patrol ships, convoy ships, as well as many cargo ships. In addition, the battleship Jean Bart was badly damaged. 2 submarines reached Toulon, where they were soon sunk. Finally, of the 168 aircraft based in Morocco and Algeria, 135 were destroyed on airfields or in combat. The Allies, for their part, lost over 3,000 killed, wounded and missing. The British fleet lost 2 destroyers, Brock and Malcolm. 2 convoy ships, Warney and Heartland, and many transport ships. In the American fleet, the battleship Massachusetts, the cruisers Wichita and Brooklyn, and the destroyers Murphy and Ludlow were severely damaged. At least 100 small craft used for troop landings were destroyed at sea or near shore, and 70 airplanes were shot down. When the senseless fighting quieted down, my first endeavour was to contact French North Africa. On November 9 in the afternoon, I invited Admiral Stark to come to me. He appeared with eyes full of tears, not yet cooled from the excitement, which, he said, caused my call, transmitted the day before by radio, but even more excited by the fighting between the French and the Americans, which he in no way expected. Eisenhower, too, is surprised and saddened, the Admiral declared. I should like, I told him, to send a mission to Algeria. I asked the United States government to make all necessary arrangements to enable the mission to reach its destination. Stark promised me his cooperation. The next day I wrote to Churchill, asking him to petition Roosevelt accordingly. I assigned to the mission Pleven, Billiot, Dastier and Frenet, who were to leave at the first sign. On November 11, a broad meeting of the Frenchmen of Great Britain, which had long been contemplated, took place. Never before had the walls of the Albert Hall seen such a multitude. Evidently the thought of North Africa was on every mind. As I watched and listened, I could sense that underneath the outward pall of jubilation, minds were torn by both joy and anxiety. It was clear that people wanted unity and could not get rid of the thought that de Gaulle and the fighting France might not be involved in some dubious scam. And when, from somewhere in the gallery, a retired general who had fled from France to England shouted from his seat, imploring me to obey Giraud, the poor fellow was immediately seized by the most excited people, dragged away, and thrown out of the hall amid friendly shouts of approval. In my speech, I emphasize what our purpose is in connection with the events that are taking place and may take place. I did so in tones moderate enough not to close the door to people of goodwill, but definite enough for everyone to realize that what I said would be put into action. To begin with, I welcome the new phase of the war, when, after so many retreats, the scales are finally tipping toward the forces of freedom. I declare that still France has been and remains at the center of the drama. France. It means one nation, one territory, one law, and I show how our people, scattered by catastrophe, are united in resistance, and that it is fighting France, not any other force, that directs and organizes the national movement. French unity, I say, is cemented by the blood of the French, those who have never recognized an armistice, those who, even after the Retendy, continue to die for France. The center around which unity is re-established is us, France which fight. To a nation that has been imprisoned, we offer struggle and light from the first day, and that is why the nation votes night and day for France in the Battle of France. That is why we expect to unite all our people and all our territories. That is why we do not allow anyone to dare to undermine the united battle for the fatherland by parallel actions, in other words, by isolated actions. But the will of the nation, which now expresses itself, though still muffled, but powerfully. That is why the French National Committee speaks in the name of France, when it asks everyone's assistance to wrest our country, the country enslaved by them, from the hands of the enemy and Vichy, to restore fully French liberties and the laws of the Republic. I end with the appeal, a common struggle for a common fatherland. Those present understood perfectly well that in the difficult party that had begun I was ready to unite with all worthy men, but that I would never, not one iota, retreat from what I had once for all taken upon myself. With loud cheers this assembly of Frenchmen expresses its approval. I shall see later that the Allies took it very differently. Their leaders and heralds, sighing and shaking their heads reproachfully, would censure us for our straightforwardness. They themselves were less demanding. Of course, the Americans, on whom the British were equal, were surprised and annoyed by the failure of the Giro. But since Eisenhower had found no other way to end the resistance than to negotiate with Darlan, well, America, then, will now do business with Darlan. On November 10, General Clark, having received word of Admiral Darlan's ceasefire order, declared in the tone of a victor giving instructions to the vanquished that, under these circumstances, all civil and military authorities will continue to perform their functions. On November 13, Nogues, Châtel, and Berger rallied around Darlan. They jointly decided that Admiral Darlan would be High Commissioner for North Africa. Soon Boyson also submitted to him. Giraud, who was equally shunned by both the Vicaists and the Gaullists, hastened to do the same, for which he was appointed commander-in-chief of the troops. On November 15, Darlan announced all these arrangements and assured that everything was done in the name of the Marshal. As the very sources of their power were dirty enough, it was necessary to give it a semblance of legitimacy. It was therefore announced that Nogues, having received from the Marshal during Darlan's brief imprisonment, had transferred his authority to the Admiral, and that the latter was thereby restored to his post. But all this casuistry was no longer satisfactory to anybody, not even to the least sensitive people. In fact, after stormy meetings where, according to the information we have, Weygand and Admiral Ulpan exhorted Marshal Pétain to approve the ceasefire order, while Laval demanded, on the contrary, to condemn this decision, the Marshal sided with the latter. In speeches and on the radio, he loudly resented the treason of his proconsuls. He declared that Darlan had failed in his mission. He ordered also the publication of a letter written to him by General Girard on May 4, where the latter swore on his honour never to contradict either the policy of Pétain or that of Laval. He made it known to the public that henceforth he himself would henceforth assume the command of the French armies. He reiterated his orders to fight the British and Americans and open the way for the troops of the Axis powers. On December 1, Admiral Plato, the Marshal's minister, to whom he has entrusted the coordination of the military operations of the three arms, addresses the Algerian troops by radio and declares, "In France, and only in France, after so many trials, the Marshal and his government will revive a national army. France will reclaim Africa, and you will see then how the traitors in a foreign wagon will..." So it was necessary to invent some other trick to legitimize the power of Darlan. Then they began to refer to a telegram sent allegedly by some minor official, the text of which, as well as the name of the sender, was never published, but the mere reference to which allowed the clan of augurs to hint, so to speak, for the gallery, that Pétain allegedly secretly approved the actions of the Admiral. Finally, the strongest argument of those whom Vichy called oath-breakers is due to the occupation of the southern zone. The Marshal is now dependent on the Germans. His orders have no legal force. Power, therefore, belongs to those to whom he handed it over while still free. President Roosevelt needed no more than this to put aside, with regard to Darlan, all his democratic and legal doubts which for 2 years he had been advancing against de Gaulle. On his orders, Clark recognized the High Commissioner and entered into negotiations with him, leading on November 22 to an agreement by virtue of which Darlan governed and commanded, provided his activities were in accordance with the views of the Anglo-American victors. Of course, the President released a message asserting that the political agreements made between Eisenhower and Darlan were only a temporary measure. But while hosting André Philippe and Tixier on November 23, annoyed by their protests, he shouted, "Of course I have negotiated with Darlan since Darlan has given me Algeria. Tomorrow I will enter into negotiations with Laval, if Laval will give me Paris." However, he immediately added, "I should very much like to see General de Gaulle to discuss all these matters, and I beg you to tell him that his visit to Washington would be most desirable." Finally, on December 7, Darlan, having secured the consent of the Allies, declared himself head of the French state in North Africa and commander-in-chief of all forces, land, air and sea, with a sort of imperial council consisting of Nogues, Giraud, Châtel, Boisson and Bergier. While in Algiers, Casablanca and Dakar officials made a 180-degree turn to keep their seats. In France itself, the enemy responded to events. German troops poured into the free zone. Vichy forbade resistance to them. Armistice army must pending demobilization to lay down their arms. General de Lattre, who still retained some illusions, courageously tried to put into practice the defense plan and take a position with the troops of the Montpellier district in the mountains of Montagnoya. He was immediately disavowed, suspended and imprisoned. While in prison, he came into contact with fighting France, who later helped him escape and summoned him to London, where he tied his fate forever to mine. General Weygand, who had tried to take refuge in Gerrit, was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Germany. In this way, the false legend of apparent independence, which the Vichy government tried to cover itself with to justify its surrender and to deceive many honest Frenchmen, was finally dispelled, since Vichy itself had not fired a single shot at the enemy. Of the outward signs of its independence, only the fleet at Toulon remained. But not for long. This fleet, a part of which actually retaining freedom of action, was commanded by Admiral Leybert, and the other weakly armed. was subordinate directly to Admiral Marchi. The maritime prefect of Toulon remained under the authority of Pétain. The Toulon fleet refused to proceed to Africa against Darlan's incantations and witnessed the Germans enter directly into port. Vichy's agreement of neutrality with the enemy ensured that our sailors did not resort to extreme action. It was the first step in destroying the fleet. Personally, I am more than convinced of this, for I wrote a secret letter to Admiral Laborde, trying to show him the way dictated by honour and duty. But, as I learned, he burst into abusive language at my address and threatened my emissary, Colonel Fourcault, but still kept my letter. On November 26, the Germans broke into Toulon to seize our ships. As they had first occupied the heights dominating the arsenal, set up artillery in the immediate vicinity of the port, placed mines all along the roadstead, the French fleet was at their mercy. So the Marshal, his ministers, the commander of the fleet, constrained by the consequences of their own indiscretion, found nothing better to do than to give orders to sink these powerful vessels. 3 battleships, Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Provence, 8 cruisers, Colbert, Duplex, Foch, Alger, Jeanne de Vienne, Galissonière, Marseillais, Mogador, 17 destroyers, 16 destroyers, 16 submarines, 7 patrol vessels, 3 patrol vessels, 60 transport vessels, tankers, minesweepers, tugs, have thus committed, by order from above, an act of suicide more deplorable and fruitless than any that can be imagined. In addition, 1 squadron destroyer, 1 destroyer, 5 tankers were not blown up and fell into the hands of the Germans. Only 5 submarines on the initiative of their courageous commanders rebelled and tried to leave. Casablanca, Casablanca, glorieux, Casablanca, glorieux, Marsouin. They managed to reach Algiers, was forced due to lack of fuel to take refuge in a Spanish port. The Venus sank in the harbour. As for me, filled with sadness and anger, I could only watch in the distance the collapse of what was one of the most important pledges of salvation of France, to greet over the airwaves some of the heroic episodes that accompanied the disaster, and to accept by telephone condolences which generously, but not without secret satisfaction, expressed to me by the English Prime Minister. However, the course of events still helped to rally the French who were already behind de Gaulle, and also helped to attract those who had hitherto not favoured him. The catastrophic collapse of the Vichy regime and the occupation of territory throughout the metropolis had indeed made it even clearer that only the resistance could shepherd France. On the other hand, Darlan's arrival in North Africa, with American support, aroused widespread resentment so strong that it created an unprecedented unanimity in our camp. Of course, in this case, we all could not help but feel deceived, could not help but be annoyed to see the Allies negotiating with our political adversaries. But here also spoke the indignation of the idealists. Thus, we listened with anger as American radio announcers, via the BBC, bellowed the call signs of Radio Free France, Honour and Homeland, and then began to broadcast the speeches, deeds and gestures of Admiral Darlan. Finally, studying the reaction of the people, who, in the midst of all the trials that had befallen them, equally condemned both the regime that had led to defeat and the regime of collaborationism, we came to the firm conviction that if de Gaulle were to falter or, worse, compromise himself, communist ideology would triumph in the minds of the desperate masses. The National Committee was convinced of this. Our comrades in arms, wherever they were, had no doubt of it either. For this reason, and for many others, I relied on an alliance as united and monolithic as a rock when I declared to the governments of Washington and London that there was not the slightest chance of a compromise between fighting France and the High Commissioner of North Africa. On November 12, I proposed to Admiral Stark to say this in my name to his government. At Washington, Philip and Tixier made a similar statement to Sumner Welles on November 13 and to Cordell Hall on November 14. On November 20, Colonel Chavignier repeated the same to McCloy. On November 23, Philip and Tixier confirmed it to Roosevelt himself. On November 16, I saw Churchill and Eden, who had been looking for an opportunity to talk to me ever since Darlan's proclamation appeared in London, in which he announced that he would continue to rule in the name of Marshall and with the consent of the Allies. It must be said that this news caused great dissatisfaction in various circles of English society, and even in the English cabinet itself. In London one could clearly catch signs of general indignation, so on this day the atmosphere was even more strained than usual, and the Prime Minister, as always, without condemning Roosevelt's actions, yet sought to emphasize that the policy of the American president is accepted by him, not without reservations. He told me bluntly that he understood and shared my feelings, but that the most important thing was to drive the Germans and Italians out of Africa. He reassured me, saying that the orders taken in Algeria Eisenhower are purely temporary in nature, and gave me to read the telegrams that they exchanged with Roosevelt on the subject. England has given her consent on the condition that it be only a manoeuvre, he said. I take note of the British point of view, I replied. My position, however, is quite different. You refer to strategic considerations, but it is precisely a strategic error to conflict with the moral aspect of war. We do not live in the 18th century, when Frederick bribed the courtiers of the Viennese court to seize Silesia, nor in the Italian Renaissance, when the police guards of Milan or the dark assassins of Florence were used, but they have never yet been made rulers of liberated nations. We wage war with the blood and soul of nations. Here I showed Churchill and Eden telegrams received from France, from which it was evident what a stupor the public opinion of the country was plunged into. Think of the possibility of the incalculable consequences which such a state of affairs might entail, I told. If France comes to the conclusion that liberation, as the Anglo-Saxons understood it, is Darlan, you may win a military victory, but morally you will lose, and in the final analysis there will be only one winner, Stalin. Then we talked about the communique which the French National Committee had issued to make it known to everyone that we had nothing to do with the Allied combinations in Algeria. In order to disseminate this communique as widely as possible, we would like to use the BBC broadcasts. I asked the British Prime Minister not to prevent this, although the London broadcasts to North Africa were under American control. Agreed, Churchill replied. I am telegraphing to Roosevelt that General de Gaulle should be allowed to make his opinion known. As the visit drew to a close, Eden took me aside and tearfully, excitedly informed me that he was personally quite shocked. I replied that I knew him too well, and was therefore not at all surprised at his words, for, speaking privately, we must admit that the game was not a clean one. Bean's behaviour only strengthened my conjectures. He himself, as well as a prominent part of the British cabinet, was certainly disgusted to follow American policy with the readiness with which Churchill did. After breakfast in Downing Street, during which the hospitable Mrs. Churchill made every effort to engage anxious ladies and deeply concerned men in conversation, the Prime Minister and I retired for a private talk. As for you, Churchill announced to me, for all the difficulty of the conjuncture, your position is excellent. The Giro is politically non-existent. The hour of Darlan will soon strike. You will be left alone. And he added, do not run into the Americans. Be patient. Sooner or later they will come to you themselves, because there is no other alternative. Very possibly, I replied. But I don't understand you. You have been waging war from day one. One might even say that you yourself personify this war. Your troops are advancing in Libya. There'd be no Americans in Africa if you hadn't beaten Rommel. Up to this very hour, no Roosevelt soldier has yet met a Hitler soldier, whereas for 3 years your men have been fighting under all latitudes. In the African affair, the fate of Europe is decided, and England belongs to Europe. Meanwhile, you have allowed the Americans to take over the leadership of the struggle. To you should belong the leadership, at least the moral leadership, of this struggle. So lead it. Public opinion in Europe will be in your favour. This statement stunned Churchill. He twisted in his chair. We parted with a tentative agreement that Franco-English unity, however acute the present crisis, must not be allowed to weaken, for this unity is now more than ever the only order of things, especially since the Americans have intervened in the affairs of the old world. That same evening the London radio reported, as I had requested, that General de Gaulle and the National Committee take no part in, and bear no responsibility for, the negotiations underway in Algiers, and that if, as a result of these negotiations, the Vichyist regime is maintained in North Africa, this decision will not be recognized by fighting France. Our message ended with the words, the union of all the overseas territories in the struggle for liberation is only possible under conditions compatible with the will and dignity of the French people. But the good intentions of the English did not resist American pressure. 3 days later, the British government forbade us to use the BBC to disseminate one statement in which French resistance organisations expressed support for our position. It was a message from France addressed to the Allied governments and signed by representatives of the 3 Southern Zone movements Combat, Liberation, Frontiera, as well as the French labour movement, which united the General Confederation of Labour, the Christian trade unions, and 4 political parties: the Socialist Action Committee, the Republican Federation, the People's Democrats, and the Radicals. The message read, "General de Gaulle is the undisputed leader of the resistance and leads the whole country. In no case will we allow the accession of those guilty of military and political treason to be seen as a pardon for their crimes. We urge that the fate of liberated French North Africa be placed in the hands of General de Gaulle as soon as possible." The censors in Washington vetoed the publication of this document. On November 21, I myself had occasion to encounter their opposition. In a speech intended for the French nation and already included in a BBC radio programme, I asked, "Must national liberation be dishonoured?" And naturally, my own answer to that question was no. A few minutes before the broadcast began, Charles Peake appeared to me and stated that by virtue of an Allied agreement, and for military reasons, London radio could not broadcast material relating to North Africa without the consent of the United States government. That in regard to my speech, consent had been sought, but receipt of a reply had been delayed, and the British government apologised. Thus, my speech and the resistance document had to be transmitted to the radio stations of the Fighting France at Brazzaville, Douala, and Beirut, which were not subject to foreign control. On November 24, during our conversation, Churchill felt obliged to speak, though not without some embarrassment, about the delay in broadcasting my speech on the BBC, since the issues raised in it, he told me, could put at stake the lives of American and British soldiers. I felt it necessary to telegraph President Roosevelt in order to obtain his consent. The answer has not yet been received. "I am well aware," I said, "that on English soil radio is beyond my control." But, judging from Churchill's demeanour, I could easily see that he had no control over it either. So, in the midst of all these upheavals, I tried to keep my balance. However, I acted more from common sense than from feeling, for the system established in Algeria seemed to me too artificial to withstand the battering ram of events, however much support it might receive from outside. The people in charge of this system acted as if in a void. They had no support in any current of public opinion. Disliked by de Gaulle, cursed by Pétain, suspected by the Atlantists, these leaders enjoyed no sympathy from anyone. No current carried them along. It was clear that they took this or that position from speculative considerations alone. Why, then, should we yield, even in a small way, to this oligarchy which has neither future nor hope? All the more so because just at the time when this clique established itself in Algeria, the prospects were extremely favourable for our movement, which was becoming more and more impressive. Immediately after the landing of the Americans in Morocco and Algiers, Fighting France extended her influence over all the French possessions in the Indian Ocean. Of these possessions, Réunion was the first to be annexed, the island of Réunion lying alone among the distant southern seas, away from the sea routes around the Cape of Good Hope, poor in natural resources, with a motley population, but fervently loyal to France, was not directly considered in the plans of the Allies. But it could easily have been the victim of a combined Japanese and German strike, especially since their route to Madagascar had been closed to them. On the other hand, we knew that most of the people of Réunion Island wanted their country to take part in the war. Therefore, I had long been looking for an opportunity to annex the island to battling France, but the Allies tried to delay my intervention because they themselves were preparing their own operation in Madagascar, and the Americans intended to land in Africa and were afraid to frighten Vichy and the enemy. Now they had no more pretext to obstruct my actions. So on November 11, I decided to carry out the accession. For many months, the destroyer Leopard, commanded by Captain Richard Evenhook, second rank, had been engaged for this purpose in escort and patrol operations in the neighbourhood of South Africa. I gave him orders to reach Réunion, and having accomplished his task, to take on board Capegore, the chief administrator of the colonies, whom we had previously appointed governor. On November 28, the vessel appeared in the roadstead of St. Denis. On seeing the flag with the Cross of Lorraine, crowds of people went into port to greet the French sailors. Many officials and military men openly showed their sympathies. The battery at Pointe de Gala alone opened fire. Leopard responded with a volley of guns and landed a unit, which, with the assistance of Public Works Manager Decugues and a local, selfless group, immediately succeeded in settling the incident. Greatly regretted, Decugues and several others were killed. As Governor Orbit retired to his residence in the mountains, Captain Richard Evenux entered into intercourse with him. With a view to pacification, it was agreed to cease all resistance, and Governor Capegori took charge of the destinies of the island. Amidst universal expressions of delight, General de Gaully's representative took up his duties. A month later, the same thing happened in Madagascar. In fact, from the time Governor-General Anne capitulated to the British, the fate of this large island had been theoretically decided. Practically, however, everything here was in doubt. It is true that on November 11, in connection with Eden's repeated proposal, I agreed to promulgate a joint communique declaring that the French National Committee and the British government were negotiating concerning Madagascar, and that the French National Committee had appointed General Legentium to the post of High Commissioner. But I did not agree to take the big island in hand unless those hands were free. So it was necessary to get the British removed from the political and administrative life of Madagascar. There were endless negotiations on this subject, and the agreement was delayed by various demarches of the English colonists. These latter at first tried to induce the Vichy administration to act under their auspices through the medium of the English military command, and then made a practical attempt to govern directly, and entrusted Lord Rennell with the conduct of affairs, assisted by trustworthy French officials. But Lord Rennell and his circle now refused to do this, and recognised the necessity of leaving the action to fighting France. Nevertheless, they wished to retain the right of control, which understandably did not suit us in the least. The agreement was finally signed on December 14 by Eden and myself, and contained, thanks to my insistence, all the necessary clauses. That same evening, speaking on the radio, I informed my listeners of this happy event, and stated that because of the above circumstances, our beautiful and large colony will be able to deploy significant military and economic activity, and emphasized the exceptional loyalty that this act has proved England, our good old ally. The agreement did indeed stipulate that the decisions taken were intended to restore France's sovereign rights in Madagascar and the islands connected therewith, that the High Commissioner would be given the authority given by French law to the Governor-General, as well as the prerogatives of the commander of French troops meet, and that the defence of Madagascar, the islands connected therewith and Reunion Island would be conducted jointly. The High Commissioner will proceed without delay to reorganize the French military forces. Until he obtains the necessary funds, the direction of the defence of the territory will be temporarily entrusted to an English general. The Commandant at Diego Sarez would be an English naval officer. When this agreement was signed, General Legentium left for Tananarive, to which a detachment was sent, including all arms from Free French Africa. Legentium, who was accompanied by the Governor-General of Saint-Map and the military commandant, Colonel Bureau, was charged with the duty of re-establishing the administrative and economic apparatus, public services, resuming foreign relations, and reorganizing the military units. At the same time, he was charged with calming minds. As a result, a few weeks after his arrival, half of the officers, 2/3 of the non-commissioned officers, and almost all the soldiers of the units that had recently fought with the Allies on the orders of Vichy, joined the ranks of the fighting France. The rest were transported to England, from where they headed for North Africa as soon as communications were restored. On sending General Legentium to Tananarive, I directed him, with a feeling of satisfaction, to visit Djibouti, which was taken possession of by the fighting France on December 28. This was no doubt the result of the events that had taken place in Madagascar, for since the beginning of the English intervention, the authorities of the French coast of Somalia had been unable to bring the necessary supplies from the island. But it was also the result of the activities carried on for 2 years by our mission in East Africa. First Paluski, then Chancel prepared the ground for the association by establishing all sorts of connections with the colony, disseminating our information there, and actively defending our interests before the Negus in Addis Ababa and before the British command in Nairobi. On the other hand, Colonel Upper and his detachment, standing in close proximity to the garrison, urged him to join us, gave him an example of how exemplary commanders and troops are bound to act, and little by little influenced the mind of the majority. But in order that all this might be realized in practice, the entry of our troops into the colony was required. Indeed, General Dupont, the governor of Djibouti, who had succeeded Noyat, was slow to get out of his command, though in his heart he wished to do so, and I wrote to him, urging him to hasten his decision. Seeing this, a part of the garrison, drawn by Lieutenant Colonel Reynaud, crossed the frontier early in November and joined Colonel Upper's detachment. Other units followed their example. Here the Washington government, desirous of turning the colony away from joining de Gaulle, sent its consul from Aden to take the place. But this latter failed to find a solution consistent with American policy. In other words, simultaneously excluding both Vichy and de Gaulle. His intervention created great excitement among the Gaullists and spurred them into action. On December 26, the troops of fighting France, under the command of Upper and Raynal, and with the consent of the British, entered French Somalia and, without firing a single shot, reached the city by rail. The question was settled. On December 28, General Dupont signed, jointly with my delegate Chancel and General Fawkes, the representative of the British command, an agreement by which the colony was transferred to the French National Committee. Chancel immediately assumed power. On December 30, Bayardel, who had been appointed governor of Djibouti, also took office. The annexation of Somalia was of great importance. All French possessions in the Indian Ocean area were now once again involved in the war, and thus the Western powers gained strategic positions here, covering Africa and the East, in case of a new threat from Japan. The city of Djibouti itself regained its importance as a transit port at the entrance to the Red Sea and opened access to Ethiopia. In addition, the French battle had received very valuable reinforcements in the form of 300 officers and 8,000 soldiers, not to mention war material for our troops engaged in Libya, as well as for the units we hoped to form in Madagascar. Finally, from the political point of view, it was significant that, during the very weeks when the system in Algeria was clearly at a standstill, the National Committee succeeded in achieving unity and in incorporating into the war effort the territories so remote and so much needed by us. But the fact that the two fragments of the French army in Africa were henceforth fighting against a common enemy contributed most of all to unity. Indeed, no amount of subterfuge could conceal from the officers and soldiers who took position on the spine of Tunis that they were now doing the same thing as their comrades in Libya and Fezzan. The same government that yesterday was cursing some is today denigrating others for, they say, aggravating the misfortunes that have befallen the country. In France, the resistance, in which people who never stopped fighting for a moment took part, was now united with those who, in Tunisia, turned their modest arms against the invader. The people who had bound all their aspirations to de Gaulle and his comrades in arms were also united in a common hope with all the French soldiers who had taken part in the common battle. I was sure that the desire for the fusion of all forces would grow stronger every day from Rabat to Gabes. Therefore, although I could not yet be responsible for the troops of French North Africa, I followed their action with the same passionate attention as that of all other French troops. A few days later, the enemy took advantage of the confusion inevitable in such cases and invaded Tunisia. The Tunisian troops under Bar were regrouped and sent, some to the districts of Beja and Medjez el-Bab, and others to the neighbourhood of Tibessa to cut the routes to Algiers. Then the division in Constantine under the command of General Velveraf in turn reached Tibessa, forming together with parts of Bar Army Corps, at the head of which was placed General Khalid, while to the south, General Delay reunited with the troops of the Sahara. On November 16, Juin took command of this army corps, which on November 19 had opened fire on the Germans at Medjez el-Bab, and on November 22 reoccupied Gafsa and Spiatla. By the end of November, from the northern to the southern borders of Tunisia, formed a sort of front, though weak and torn. But since it was held by men of determination, it provided the first cover for the Allied combat units being put into action. December came, and both camps grew stronger. The Germans and Italians, under General Neering, received reinforcements of troops and arms delivered across the Gulf of Sicily or from Tripolitania via Gabes. General Anderson's British First Army advanced its advance corps into the coastal area west of Tunis and Bizerte. General Giraud attached to Juin's forces first an Algerian division commanded by Delaine, then another division and Moroccan infantry battalions brought in by General Matanat. The Americans had an armoured division supporting the British action and paratroopers and tanks supporting the French action. In short, 2 months after the landing, General Eisenhower brought into contact with the enemy only a small number of Anglo-American units, the delay in expanding operations due to the fact that he feared that the Spanish would not go on the offensive in Morocco, as well as reluctance to immediately put into action their still insufficiently shelled troops. Last but not least, Not the least role played difficulties in the deployment of air units, food in the organisation of communications in such a vast country as French North Africa, especially if the Auchisquieu in the first months of 1943 more cargo was lost than in the whole war. During this critical period, the fate of the entire campaign depended largely on the actions of French troops, a role worthy of all praise, for they performed with obsolete weapons, having no aircraft, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, no trucks, because all the material was transferred to the armistice commissions or destroyed in the battles against the Americans. Single pieces of modern weaponry were available only in isolated units or were camouflaged in shelters in the desert. Meanwhile, Bizerte had fallen victim to open treachery. Admiral de Ryan, following orders brought from Vichy by Plato, allowed German troops to enter the city unhindered. On December 7, Neering demanded from the ill-fated admiral to disarm the garrison and hand over to the Germans ships, port, arsenal, fortifications, which was done immediately. Thus, the most important stronghold passed into the hands of the enemy, who in addition seized one destroyer, 2 patrol vessels, 9 submarines standing in the roadstead or in the dock. This deplorable episode completed the series of disgraceful deeds. Henceforth, with the exception of the African phalanx fighting on the enemy's side against the Allies, at no point in Africa Vichy did not have French arms. What little that still remained on the hands of the soldiers, they will manage to put in the service of France, some in Tunisia, others in Lebanon. As you know, it was with the assistance of the group Lamin British began the offensive against Rommel. During the breakthrough on December 23, brilliantly conducted by Montgomery in the area of El Alamein, the 1st Light Division under Koenig was put into action on the southern flank of the front on the steep slopes of Kaimamet, sourced to fight in difficult terrain, with a stretched front line and a well-entrenched enemy. Our troops suffered significant losses. In particular, Amilak Vari died a brave death. A few days later, the 2nd Light Division under Colonel Lessandri and the armoured column of Colonels Remy and Kearsarson valiantly participated in the pursuit of the enemy undertaken by the 8th Army. I had approved in advance the plan for the use of our troops. But soon the landing of British troops in Morocco and Algeria, as well as the opening of the front in Tunisia, led me to the thought that it would be very unfortunate before the time would be disempowered Lamin's grouping. Much more prudent was to put it into action with all the technical means in the later phase of the operation, when the Allied armies coming from the west and east, when on French soil will unite the troops of the Lorraine Cross with the troops of North Africa and will smash the enemy on the shores of our sea. That is why I approved the decision of the British command, which on November 10 withdrew the troops of Free France from the front and put them in reserve near Tobruk. I soon agreed to a suggestion made to me by Lamina concerning the formation of a full combat division, which would combine the 2 light divisions. We formed this splendid formation with 3 brigades, Brosset, Alessandri, and Leland, equipping them entirely with artillery put in order at Djibouti. The 1st French Free Division was thus created. Lamin and his troops could hardly contain their impatience and waited for the opportunity to re-enter the field, but this time for decisive operations in the Great African Battle, which lasted for 2 years with the unchanged participation of our troops. In the meantime, we had the long-awaited opportunity to occupy Fezzan and to introduce into the battles played out on the Mediterranean coast, a French connection that had come from the Lake Chad area across the Sahara. The implementation of this project, which I finally matured as soon as in Fort Lamy joined Eboit and Marchand, was prepared by Leclerc since 1940 and has passed several stages. The formation of the desert troops, the organization of supplies, the capture of Kufra, deep reconnaissance of Italian positions. It was time to put everything at stake. On November 14, confirming my instruction of September 22, I instructed General Leclerc to go on the offensive, putting as one of the first tasks of the French occupation of Fezzan, using it in the future to act in the direction of either Tripoli or Gay-Bissa in conjunction with the Allied operations in Tripolitania. I added, in the conduct of this operation you are subordinate only to me. However, you must act in concert with General Alexander, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in the east, so that from the moment you reach Fezzan, you can get effective support from the air. I expect to begin your offensive at the moment when our allies reach the Gulf of Sirte. In truth, from the beginning of the Anglo-American landings in Algeria and Morocco, I had conceived the idea of combining the invasion of our troops in Libya from the south with their advance into the Niger region, and gave the order to move on Singer Column prepared specifically for this purpose. But with the end of the struggle between the French and the Allies, I decided to stop this secondary operation. It was necessary to carry out only the main one. This operation required intense preparation. The transfer of parts from the territory of Chad, a 1,000-kilometre march of convergence, up to contact with fortified points of the enemy, delivery directly to the site of the material part, fuel, ammunition, food, material reserves. In short, everything on which the success of any attack was based. Since at the end of November, the offensive Montgomery developed in favourable conditions, and in Tunisia established the front line of the Allies, I gave Leclerc November 28 or. Starting on December 2, you can act on your own initiative, taking into account the instructions of General Alexander. But no matter how eager Leclerc and his troops to go into the melee, their performance took place only on December 12 due to the fact that the advance of the 8th Army was delayed in the area of El Agila. In the meantime, we had to parry the intention of the British to extend their hold on Fezzan as soon as it was repulsed by us. General Alexander, on November 28, notified Leclerc that he was sending English officers who were to be entrusted with administrative duties in the occupied territories. These officers, reported the English commander-in-chief, will be attached to you to accompany your troops. They will exercise civil administration in the territories you occupy until the unification of the whole of Tripolitania under the English military authorities. At the same time, Alexander notified Leclerc that the economic policy of London forbids the circulation of the francs in Fezzaga. On December 1, Charles Peake, who, contrary to his merits or perhaps because of them, had sometimes had the most unfavourable assignments imposed upon him, handed me, without undue illusions, a note from Eden on the same subject. I replied to Peake by refusing to accept the note, endeavouring to do so as kindly as possible, and telegraphed to General Leclerc. In the battle for Africa, Fezzan must be France's share. Fezzan is the geographical link between southern Tunisia and the territory of Chad. You must unconditionally reject all English interference in this area, in whatever form it may take, political, administrative, financial, etc. On December 22, the rapprochement operation was completed. The offensive began. After 2 weeks of fierce fighting groups in Gold and Delange, acting respectively in the direction of El Arnabi and Gatram, and with air support Squadron Brittany, seized the positions of the enemy, previously divided with his flying columns. Under their command, Dio, Masu, Jaffroy, Sarazak, Dabzak, and others conducted a number of successful battles and captured many trophies. On January 12, the capture of Sibir opened the road to Tripoli. On January 13, the post of Merzouk was repulsed by our troops. We took 1,000 prisoners, including 40 officers, took 20 cannons, many tanks, hundreds of mortars, machine guns, and automatic rifles. While Leclerc's troops were preparing to advance to the north, the functions of the military commandant of Fezzan took over Colonel Delange. Thus, through bravery and perseverance, this tasty fruit of the desert was finally plucked. On January 13, 1943, I announced to the country the success of our weapons. But I said over the radio, the efforts of the glorious soldiers of France will comfort her, at least a little in her troubles. Yes, the long and arduous trials demanded by careful preparation under the skies of the equator, the deadly fatigue of columns rushing forward among the rocks and sand of the deserts, the exhausting flights of air squadrons, the bloody encounters with posts, and the battles with enemy troops and aircraft. The whole weight of this march was borne by strong and pure-hearted men, and all of them, from their young and glorious general down to the last unknown soldier, brought their humble gift for the sorrow and pride of France. But if in the military sense the outlook began to brighten, in the political field it had never been more gloomy. At Carlton Gardens we were sufficiently informed, for many military officials, journalists who shuttled between Africa and England, considered it their duty to pass on letters and information to us. In addition, some Gaullists from Algeria and Morocco managed to reach us, taking advantage of the general confusion. So we learned that Darlan's stay in the top leadership position is fiercely criticised on the spot. The Vichyists hesitated when they learned of the Marshal's formal disapproval. The Gaullists resented rightfully this so-called temporary measure. Prominent figures who had negotiated with Murphy for the elevation of Girard, which never took place, realised that their hopes had been grossly deceived. Many among them, both military and civil servants, were severely repressed. Thus, General Berthoud, Colonel Magnan, and Comptroller Groman were arrested in Morocco on Nogues's orders and almost shot. Only with great difficulty Eisenhower managed to transport them to Gibraltar. From Algeria, General Mast and Colonel Beryl were forced to leave for the Middle East. The Navy, the Air Force, and the Army resented watching Darlan capitalize on his 180-degree turn and counted the sunken ships, crashed airplanes, and dead bodies of soldiers whose deaths he was responsible for. Finally, the fact that the fleet at Toulon preferred to go to the bottom, only to disobey Darlan, suggested to many that his management of affairs is henceforth only an inconvenience. This state of affairs induced me to get in touch with Algiers as soon as possible. The mission which I had wanted to send to Africa, with Roosevelt's and Churchill's authorization, had of course not yet been allowed to go there. Washington and London sought 1,000 excuses to delay it. In early December, I asked General Eisenhower that he himself received in Algeria General Dastier de la Vigerie, whom I instructed to establish there useful for the cause with the French leaders. On this occasion, as later on in many others, I met on the part of the American Commander-in-Chief the understanding which had been denied me by the political authorities of his country. He agreed to my request. It is also true that Eisenhower, astonished by the resistance he encountered at the landing, disoriented by the intrigues on which many Frenchmen were not sparing, alarmed by the confusion of minds, greatly feared how this general excitement would not lead to disorder and not disrupt the security of communications in the midst of the battle for Tunisia. Thus my intention of finding in North Africa a ground of agreement with those who were worthy of it seemed to him to be quite in the general interest of the Allies. General Dastier arrived in Algiers on December 20. What he saw there gave him the impression of a very real crisis, hardly contained within the boundaries by the police apparatus with which the authorities had surrounded themselves. But underneath everything was at a boiling point. Dastier found General Giraud extremely annoyed at his failure at the time of the landing to persuade the army to follow him. At the same time, he was bitterly disappointed that the Americans had refused his request to entrust him with the command of the Allied forces, and he felt humiliated because he retained his functions only at the will of Darlan. This very discontent inclined his ear to our proposals. Thus, when my envoy urged him to establish relations with battling France, particularly with regard to the coordination of military operations and the recruitment of troops, Giraud favoured contact. The Count of Paris, who had come from Morocco, pointed out to General Dastier that the situation he had created seemed to him not only serious but directly harmful to French interests. The matter of paramount importance, in his opinion, was to remove the admiral without delay, and thereupon to unite all Frenchmen of goodwill. He was personally in Algiers for the purpose of rallying his supporters for the sake of strengthening their unity. He was ready to take part in any arbitration if asked. The Count, however, on this occasion expressed complete disinterestedness in all that concerned his personal interests. Lemaitre du Breul made no secret of the fact, as did his friends, that he was aggrieved at being excluded from the commanding posts which, he said, he had earned by his political ability and services rendered to the Americans. Under the auspices of General Giraud, who, according to Lemaitre du Breul, was to become head of state, Lemaitre himself was prepared to take the chair of the Council of Ministers in the United Government and to entrust General de Gaulle with the portfolio of Minister of National Defence. On the other hand, Dastier learned that the first gusts of the hurricane had awakened the local politicians, who had long remained obediently silent. On November 24, Saurin, Froger, Deyron, the presidents of the General Councils of Oran, Algiers, and Constantine, who were also joined by the Algerian deputy Sada, wrote to Darlan, "Having made yourself dependent on the Marshal's government, which, however, as you yourself have recognized, is no longer free to act, and having assumed the functions of the representative of that government in North Africa, you have none of the qualities necessary to exercise the authority of a legitimate and independent government." Finally, referring to the role of the Americans, my envoy noted that, while continuing to cooperate with Admiral Darlan, Eisenhower and his staff believed that the High Commissariat should be only a transitional stage and insisted on their desire to keep in direct communication with General de Gaulle. As for the multitude of men who, for a variety of motives, had, while still under Vichy rule, been involved in the resistance, some of whom had assisted the Allied invasion with arms, these men, who were now being persecuted particularly fiercely, felt, according to General Dastier, a latent but very acute discontent. his brother Henry, who held a considerable position in the High Commissariat, Professor Capitine, the leader of the combat movement in North Africa, and many other well-informed persons described to my commissioner the atmosphere of conspiracy in which the resistance supporters lived, and said that some bloody incident could be expected from hour to hour. Impressed by all he had seen and heard, and prompted by Murphy, General Dastier agreed to enter into negotiations with Darlan. He hoped that their meeting would take place in private. But the admiral received him surrounded by a whole Areopagus, including Generals Gerard and Berger, all of whom sat with grim faces, and in every word of theirs could be sensed duplicity and discontent. Darlan had an evidently haggard look, but apparently wishing to cheer up his associates, he found it necessary to show off to my representative. He declared that he was the master of the situation, that it was necessary to unite all the French, that he himself was ready to facilitate this task by granting amnesty to those who had been helping the Allies since the beginning of the armistice. And he himself would make public his decision to resign the day after the end of the war, but for the time being he and he alone represented the only possible centre of unification. This feigned confidence was murderously contradicted by the true state of things, by that general nervousness which even the admiral himself could not shake off, so that it was impossible to be deceived. Dastier told Darlan this, not failing to refer to the public opinion of France, whence he had directly come. Then the admiral, flaring up, reproached Dastier for having come to Algiers to sow confusion. "And what is your opinion?" addressed Dastier to Giraud. For from you I await a reply to the proposal made to you by General de Gaulle concerning the coordination of the troops under your command and the forces of the France battleground." Giraud remarked that he was ready to settle the matter, but Darlan dryly interrupted him. "No, no, General, that is my business." A profound silence reigned. General Dastier put an end to this burdensome scene by declaring to the Admiral in full voice that his, Admiral Darlan's, tenure of his present position was the chief hindrance to unity, and that the best thing he could do was to step down as soon as possible. As a result of this conversation, the Americans let General Dastier know that Darlan demanded his departure and that they themselves agreed to this demand. Dastier returned to London on December 24. He was convinced from his stay in Algiers that Darlan, feeling the ground shaky under his feet, would soon clear the place. Toward evening of that day, on leaving a Christmas tree set up by our sailors, I learned of Darlan's death. His murderer, Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, was the spokesman and instrument of the unbridled anger that boiled in every soul. But it is not impossible that some policy of those who had decided to remove the provisional measure had been secretly at work behind the scenes, having previously availed themselves of its services. This young man, almost a child, shaken by the whole series of ominous events, believed that by removing what he considered a scandalous obstacle from the path of French reconciliation, he would serve the cause of his unhappy fatherland. On the other hand, he maintained, right up to the time of his execution, that he was pinning his hopes on outside intervention in his defence by sufficiently high and influential persons to whom the local authorities could refuse nothing. Of course, no private citizen has the right to kill anyone except on the battlefield. Of course, Darlan's behaviour as a holder of power and a leader could only be sub judice by the French authorities, and not by any group or individual. However, can one not understand what gave rise to this explosion of youthful rage? That is why the investigation itself, truly strange and crude in its methods, which lasted only a few hours, the hasty and abrupt trial before a hastily assembled military tribunal that met at night in private, the immediate and secret execution of Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, the orders given to the censors, all this leads to the idea that some wanted at all costs to conceal the reason that pushed the young man to murder, and that they were trying to ignore circumstances that, if not justify the drama, explain it, and to some extent even make us understand the perpetrator. However, if the tragic murder of Darlan censured by many, the very fact of his disappearance from the scene met the iron logic of events. For history in great moments tolerates at the helm of power only those people who are able to direct the course of events. It was so far gone that Darlan could neither add to what was to be accomplished nor prevent it. Everyone, and above all the Admiral himself, was aware that the page had already been turned. But it could have been otherwise if he had not missed the opportunity. In 1940, our Navy and indeed could and should have played a major role in the national defence, although for centuries Due to the fact that the fate of France was decided on the continent, it was pushed to the back. During the military catastrophe that struck the metropolis, the Navy fortunately survived. From that moment on, oceans, distance, speed, in short, all the factors that determined its role took precedence. At its disposal were our overseas possessions, which also survived. Allies threatened by the enemy from the sea would give aid without bargaining. Combining its strength with that of their fleet, it could blockade and harass the enemy, cover the coasts of Africa, or dominate there, transporting all the necessities of a liberating army, and one day bring it back to our shores. But to accomplish such a task, the head of the fleet needed not only a propensity for risk, but also the passion of a patriot who wants to serve one France, no matter what happens to this fleet in the future. But such was not such a man as Darlan. All his pretensions, all his cares were given to the Navy, but to the Navy alone. In the years of the general lethargy and fragility of the state, and in these conditions almost all his conscious life was spent, he was entirely absorbed in one thing. The fleet, this powerful organism, its interests, its charms, its machinery. In times of peace he was able, using all his ardour and all his dexterity, to lure from the authorities the means to build a well-equipped fleet, but he regarded it as his own domain, existing by itself and for its own sake. When France was defeated, what mattered most to Darlan was that the fleet was not defeated. When the surrender occurred, he accepted it, comforted by the thought that the general catastrophe would pass the fleet by. When the conflict became worldwide, and the fleet had every opportunity to become the nation's refuge, Darlan's only goal was not to let it go, but to preserve it at all costs. It was on behalf of the fleet that he wanted to become head of the Vichy government. It is in order to ensure the fleet field of action and his place in events. He repeatedly gave orders to oppose the Gaullists and the Allies. He opposed England in collaboration with the invaders, because he wanted to gain the upper hand in what he called the naval rivalry. And when at last he decided to end the struggle which he had planned to wage on the shores of Africa against the English and Americans, what prevailed in his soul a belated desire to defeat the invader of the mother country, or a decision to change camp in the hope of gathering the scattered remnants of the fleet. But since in Tunisia, in Fort de France, in Alexandria sailors refused to obey him, and in Casablanca, Oran Bizerte from the ships left only miserable wreckage, Admiral Darlan realized that if France can win the war, his personal party lost. France without a strong navy cannot be France. But the navy must be her navy. It is for the government to form the navy, to direct it, to use it as an instrument of national interest. This is precisely what the regime, which for many decades now has been sailing on the will of the waves without managing the living forces of the nation, has failed to do. In my view, the Algerian assassination has revealed the root cause of our ordeal. Like all the unheard of misfortunes that have befallen France, the mistakes of Admiral Darlan, the tragic fate of our navy, the deep wound inflicted on the soul of our sailors, were all the consequences of a long illness of the whole organism of the state. Darlan's disappearance might have had serious consequences for the cause of French unification. I should have taken advantage of the coincidence. On December 25, I telegraphed to General Giraud that the assassination attempt in Algeria is an indication and a warning, and that it is necessary more than ever to establish a national power there. I wrote further, I suggest that you, General, meet me as soon as possible on French territory, either in Algiers or in Chad. We would discuss measures which would help to unite under a temporary central authority all French territories capable of fighting for the cause of the liberation and salvation of France. If I was in such a hurry to send this message, it was only because we had no right to wait now, when at last the possibility of an agreement presented itself. But I addressed it to General Giraud because I believed that he would succeed Darlan. Indeed, the Americans in Algiers now had the opportunity of using the man on whom their choice had fallen from the beginning, and only the presence of the admiral prevented them from realizing their intention. As for the necessary formalities, they depended solely on the Imperial Council, that is, on Nogues, Boyson, Chattel and Berger, who were unquestionably in command of Eisenhower and Murphy. Indeed, General Giraud, on December 26, was invested with full powers and given the very strange title of civilian and military commander-in-chief. If he had agreed to my proposal, if we had united with him against the will of intriguers and strangers, if we had called upon all who wished to drive out the enemy to unite at our example, The basis for the organization of a credible wartime government could have been found at once. In this way, the long months of turmoil could have been avoided, had it not been for the lingering resentments and grievances of some Frenchmen, had it not been for the desire of the Allies to retain control of power in North Africa and to prevent France from appearing there as a sovereign power. The common sense of the nation would have prevailed much sooner. As I expected, the reply sent me by General Giraud on December 29th was very evasive. While at first expressing full agreement with me as to the necessity of uniting the French, he, wishing to delay the moment, gave the same reasons which I had given for hastening the matter. In view of the fact, he wrote, that the recent assassination has caused deep excitement in civil and military circles in North Africa, the present atmosphere is not favourable to our meeting. At the same time, referring to the military situation in North Africa and passing off as his own, with only slight modifications, my proposal for the organization in Africa of a mutual liaison made to him through General Destier, he added, I would prefer that you should send me a competent representative to establish cooperation between the French armed forces fighting against a common enemy. Naturally, I was not at all satisfied with this evasive position. Having received a reply from General Giraud, I immediately, on January 1, sent him a telegram. In this second message, I expressed my satisfaction that the first exchange of views between us had taken place. But I asserted that the unification of the whole empire and of all French forces with those of the resistance must in no way be postponed. I am convinced, I wrote, that only a provisional central authority, established on the basis of national unity, achieved in the interests of the conduct of the war, is capable of giving proper leadership to the French effort, of maintaining the integrity of French sovereignty, and of representing France with dignity abroad. So I renewed my proposal for a meeting, and added, I realize the difficulty of the situation in Algeria, but we could meet without difficulty at Fort Lamy, or at Brazzaville, or at Beirut, at your choice. I await with confidence your reply. In setting down on paper my appeals for unity, I had great doubts as to the result of our telegraphic correspondence. It was hardly to be expected that secret documents, and yet viewed in Algiers by Anglo-American agents, could raise a great whirlwind capable of sweeping away all obstacles and objections. I therefore decided to appeal to French public opinion, believing that its influence would ultimately be irresistible. On January 2, I issued a statement in which I appealed in this sense to the French. It happened that a very serious incident which had occurred 2 days before in Algiers reinforced my arguments. By order of Giraud, several dozen men were arrested who had been assisting the Americans since the Allied landing, and most of whom belonged to the police or administrative apparatus. The civilian and military commander-in-chief explained to Allied journalists who rushed to come for information that he acted in this way to foil a new conspiracy and prevent further assassinations, particularly, as he said, the murder of Robert Murphy. The case was allegedly that persons who had until recently been associated in their activities with the American diplomat had become disillusioned and now wished to settle accounts with him. I was thus more than right in pointing in my statement to the confusion prevailing in French North Africa. I pointed to the ouster of fighting France as the main explanation. I enumerated the consequences of this, the unfavourable situation for the development of military operations, the fact that France at the decisive moment was deprived of her main trump card, a united empire, the stupor of the French people distraught over their troubles. I also pointed out the sure remedy, which was the creation of a representative provisional central authority, whose basis would be national unity, whose inspiration would be the martial spirit of liberation, and whose laws would be the laws of the Republic. But I solemnly announced also my proposal to General Giraud for a meeting, and my conviction that the French situation and the general military situation did not admit of any postponement. This declaration and the comments it provoked struck a nerve with the Washington government. It was displeased that the distance which separated its doctrine from its policy was now measured publicly. When it became known that I had approached Giraud with an offer of alliance and he was slow to accept it, everyone realized that the general's behavior was directly dictated by Murphy's admonition, and this meant that Americans, while preaching unity, were in practice opposed to it. In reality, President Roosevelt, under cover of a statement of quite the opposite character, believed that the French question was his personal sphere, that the threads of our differences converged in his hands, that the civil authorities, which would one day be born out of the present disorder, would be born of his will. For this reason, he first bet on de Gaulle and Pétain at the same time. Then, anticipating a break with the Marshal, put forward Giraud. Then, convinced that the former prisoner of Königstein failed, opened the barrier to Darlan, and finally, after the death of the Admiral, again let Giraud. It now seemed to President Roosevelt the best course of action to keep battling France, and the Algerian authorities separated until he himself could present both sides with his own solution. And it was unlikely that this solution would ensure the formation of a truly French government. These intentions of Roosevelt were no secret to me. I was therefore not particularly surprised to learn that my statement was greeted coldly in Washington. On January 4, Under-Secretary of State Samuel Wells, receiving our delegate Tixier, told him that his government did not approve of the proposals I had made to the Giro and the fact that they had been widely publicized, because I was putting the political problem first. When asked by Tixier what was wrong with this, the American minister, for the umpteenth time, referred to the requirements of the military situation as if the alliance proposed by de Gaulle could threaten Eisenhower's communications in North Africa. Hidden confirmation of the president's intentions to directly intervene in our affairs, I received the very day after the death of Darlan, when the Americans proposed to postpone my trip to Washington. Meanwhile, Roosevelt himself, after his troops had landed in Africa, had invited me to come. Practically, the visit was as if prepared. I was to depart on December 27, reach Accra by airplane, and there board an American cruiser that would take me to the United States. Admiral Stark left London on December 20 to make arrangements for my trip. General Catroux, who had been assigned to accompany me, arrived from Beirut at Accra on December 24. But just on that day Darlan died, and at once the President's new intention was revealed. I noticed this change at the same time, for on December 26, Churchill, acting apparently on Roosevelt's instructions, asked me if I did not think it necessary, in view of the circumstances, to postpone my departure. The next day the American government handed me a note in the same spirit. Thus the reasons which had induced Giraud to postpone our meeting now became particularly clear to me. His reply to my second message, received on January 6, finally strengthened me in my opinion. He agreed in principle to our meeting in Algiers, and no longer spoke this time of the unfavourable atmosphere created by Darlan's death. But, referring to previous commitments, he said that he saw no possibility of meeting before the end of January. I regret that they not without some harshness. I regret that the commitments you have made force you to postpone until the end of January the meeting which I had proposed for December 25. I must say with all frankness that, together with the National Committee, I hold a different opinion as to the urgent necessity of achieving the unity of the Empire and uniting its efforts with those of the national resistance. But while I was waiting to see what steps Roosevelt would take, Churchill suddenly reminded himself. January 17, Eden handed me a telegram sent by the British Prime Minister from Morocco. Churchill asked me to come to him. I have the opportunity, he wrote, to arrange here your meeting with General Giraud in complete secrecy and with the best prospects. I expressed no enthusiasm on this occasion. True, Eden gave me to understand that Roosevelt is also in Morocco, where the heads of the Allied powers have arranged a conference to jointly outline plans of action. But then why didn't Churchill tell me about it? Why did the invitation come from him alone? If I was to come to Anfa only to participate in the competition as an English ward, and the Americans will put their own, the comedy could turn out not only unworthy but also dangerous. I replied to Churchill with a refusal. It was sent back at the same time with a message addressed to Giraud. Remember, I wrote to him, I am still ready to meet you on French territory among the French, wherever and whenever you wish. 2 days later, Eden again handed me a telegram from Churchill. The British Prime Minister, annoyed at my refusal, especially since the Americans had witnessed it, implored me to reconsider. Otherwise, he declared, public opinion would condemn me severely, and he himself would do nothing to support fighting France before the United States so long as I remained at the head of the movement. But this time he said that he was authorized to bring to my attention that the invitation to the conference comes from the President of the United States as well as from him, Churchill, that above all the questions concerning North Africa would be discussed there, that the President as well as Churchill himself would be happy for me to take part in the discussion on the subject. Determined to disregard the threatening notes in Churchill's message, which after many similar occasions no longer impressed me, I agreed that the military situation and the condition in which France temporarily found itself did not allow me to refuse to meet the President of the United States and His Majesty's Prime Minister. In such terms, I finally expressed my agreement, emphasizing nevertheless that the matters to be discussed arose as a consequence of an enterprise in which France in combat had not participated, and that the situation to which it has led does not appear to be very favourable to the Allies and, at any rate, before sending my reply, I solemnly convened the National Committee, which, after scrutinizing the case, approved my going to Anfer, if only to meet Roosevelt in person. It was not without intention that we delayed the discussion for some time. However, and then I was not particularly in a hurry to leave. Along with the appointed to accompany me companions, Kratu, Darjanliu, Palevsky, who became my chief of staff, Edgar de Boyember, who had just arrived from France after escaping from prison in Gagny, where he was imprisoned by the Vichy government in connection with his role in the Dakar case. Finally, and unfavourable atmospheric conditions delayed our departure. It was not until January 22 that we arrived at Fedela. There was an American General Wilbur, who had been instructed to meet us in complete secrecy. I had known him from the higher military school. He greeted me on behalf of President Roosevelt. Besides him were present Codrington, who greeted me on behalf of Churchill, and Colonel Linares, who had brought us an invitation to breakfast from General Giraud. Military honours were accorded us. But an American guard was lined up around us. American cars were filed to the airplane. I got into the first car. Wilbur, before following my example, dipped a rag in the mud and dabbed the windows. All these precautions had been taken to conceal the arrival in Morocco of General de Gaulle and his companions. In Anfer, the Allies requisitioned an entire neighbourhood and evicted their inhabitants somewhere. In addition, a large space around their residence had been cleared of people. The conference took place behind a solid ring of barbed wire. American patrols were on duty outside and inside and allowed no one in or out. Domestic services were provided by American soldiers. In short, it was true captivity. That the Americans themselves lived in the position of captives is their business. But the fact that they were forcing me into the same regime, and even on sovereign French soil, seemed to me simply insulting. And the first words with which I addressed General Giraud did not sound particularly friendly. "How is it," I said to him, "that 4 times I offered to see you, and now we happen to meet in a ring of barbed wire among foreigners? Don't you feel how insulting this is to national honour?" The embarrassed Giraud answered me that he could not have done otherwise. To tell the truth, I believed him, considering the conditions in which he had placed himself with regard to the Americans. The dinner, however, passed in a cordial atmosphere. We reminisced amicably about the past days, and at my request our host told of his remarkable escape from Koenigstein. But when we rose from the table, General Giraud spoke on other subjects. He insisted that he thinks only of military affairs, that he does not wish to engage in politics, that he never listens to an interlocutor if he tries to expound to him any theory or program, that he does not read newspapers and does not listen to the radio. Whether because of these convictions or because of the commitments he had made, he declared that he was in solidarity with the proconsuls, with Nogues, indispensable in Morocco, with Boison, who skillfully defended the colony against foreign invasions, even the German one, with Peyrutin, who had recently replaced the Governor-General of Algeria, Châtel, and who had grip, with Bergier, who had good strategic brains. He made no secret of the fact that whatever his determination, indeed unshakable, to fight the Germans, he had nothing against the Vichy regime. He emphasized, finally, that the spontaneous, popular, revolutionary character of the resistance in the country was incomprehensible to him. Moreover, he disapproved of it. After this first conversation, we bade farewell to Giraud and went to our villa. The day was drawing to a close, and as I thought it a good thing to remain in my room, I received a visit from Macmillan, the English minister sent to Algiers to coordinate affairs in the Western Mediterranean. Macmillan indicated to me that he and Murphy were trying to find a formula acceptable to both Giraud and myself, and that such a formula could be proposed to us by Roosevelt and Churchill. This was precisely the intervention I had foreseen. I made it clear to Macmillan that the Giraud-de Gaulle agreement could only be realized between the French. At the reinforced request of the English minister, however, I went to see Churchill. In going to the Prime Minister, I told him, not without vehemence, that if I had known that I would have to live on French soil behind barbed wire and guarded by American bayonets, I would never have come here. But this is an occupied country, he exclaimed. Then, both of us somewhat mollified, we got down to the heart of the matter. The Prime Minister told me that he had agreed with the President on a project for the solution of the French overseas possessions. Generals Giraud and de Gaulle would jointly preside over the committee, where they were equal, as were all the other members, who were also equal among themselves in every respect. But Giraud would exercise supreme military command, on the consideration that the United States, which would provide the material part of a united French army, wished to negotiate on the subject with him alone. No doubt, Churchill added, my friend General Giraud may also join the committee as third chairman. As for Nogues, Boyson, Peyrot and Bergerie, they will retain their posts and join the committee. The Americans have recognized them and wish them to be given confidence. I replied to Churchill that this decision was in keeping with the level, very honourable indeed, of the American senior en cause, but that I did not see how he himself, Churchill, could take it seriously. As for me, I am obliged to reckon with what is left of France's sovereignty. I have, and there can be no doubt about it, the deepest respect for him and for Roosevelt, but I do not in any way regard them as competent to decide on the administration of the French Empire. The Allies, without consulting me, in spite of me, established the system which had been in force in Algeria. Not having apparently derived much joy from it, they now intend to bind fighting France to it also. But this does not suit her at all. If she is to disappear, she would prefer to disappear with honour. Churchill did not seem to grasp the moral side of the question. Look, he said, at what my own government represents. When I formed it at one time, I indicated that I would fight tirelessly against the spirit of Munich, and I put all our apparent Munichites in it. And what? They have kept pace so that now they are indistinguishable from all others. If you say so, I objected, you are, therefore, overlooking what is going on now in France. And I personally am not the sort of politician who is anxious to form a cabinet and secure a majority in Parliament. The Prime Minister, however, asked me to think over the project proposed to me tonight. He added, you will have a conversation with the President of the United States, and you will see for yourself that in this matter we are in solidarity with him. He escorted me by the garden to the front gate, and the English sentry standing near it took guard. No, he said to me that if there are American sentries here, there are also English sentries nearby, and they get along very well together. Soon there came for me from Roosevelt to make arrangements for a meeting. I went to see the President late in the afternoon. Sitting side by side on a sofa, we spent an hour together in the great hall of his villa. Although my companion was careful to pretend that we were face to face, I noticed some shadows slipping about the outer gallery and the curtains moving suspiciously in the corners of the room itself. Later I learned that our conversation was being covertly listened to by Harry Hopkins's several secretaries, and that armed policemen were guarding Roosevelt. It was their elusive presence that created the strange atmosphere in which our first conversation with Roosevelt took place. That evening, as well as in all our subsequent meetings, he tried to get into my spirit, wasted, wanting to convince me not so much arguments as personal charm, but never once retreated from the decision made in advance. The highest aspirations possessed Franklin Roosevelt. His intelligence, knowledge, courage, everything contributed to it. The mighty power of which he was the head provided him with all the means for this. The war gave him the right occasion for it, whereas the great nation he ruled had always preferred to shy away from all action far from its homeland, and had little confidence in a Europe constantly torn by battles and revolutions. The American soul was now imbued with a kind of messianism, and began to conceive vast schemes. The United States, marvelling at its own wealth, feeling that its dynamism could no longer find its proper application at home, burning with a desire to help the poor and oppressed in every corner of the globe, succumbed to the tendency to intervene, under the outer shell of which lurked an instinctive desire to dominate. It was this tendency that President Roosevelt was primarily expressing. Thus, he did everything he could to get his country involved in the world conflict. He was now fulfilling his destiny and was in a hurry to fulfill it, because death had already given him secret news of itself. Ever since America had entered the war, Roosevelt had decided that the world would be an American world, that it was his right to dictate the terms of its organization. He wanted countries crushed by the trials of war to recognize his right to judge, and believed that, in particular, he would be the savior of France and the apex of its destinies. Thus the fact that in the midst of the struggle France could rise not merely in the form of a fragmented and thus acceptable resistance, but as a sovereign and independent nation was contrary to his intentions. Politically, he was by no means inclined towards me. Still less was he inclined to feel it by virtue of the fact that he was continually exposed to the attacks of public opinion. It was the source of his power, and it could also remove him from the seat of power. During the war itself, Roosevelt had to stand for election twice. In addition, between elections, the press and radio did not give the president rest. He was able to charm, but embarrassed in the depths of his soul of his painful disease, against which he courageously fought, was particularly sensitive to the reproaches and ridicule of the enemy. And it was his policy toward General de Gaulle that caused the most bitter controversy in America. It should be added that he, like movie stars, frowned unhappily when he saw that others could also play a role. Roosevelt did not particularly favorably look at my person, although he hid his feelings under the gallant treatment of a patrician. That evening we tried to outdo each other in courtesy, but, as if by mutual agreement, did not specify anything about French affairs, having sketched out in the lightest dotted line what Churchill had roughly sketched out for me. The president gave me the polite indication that their plan would be carried out as he had decided. I, on the other hand, delicately pointed out to him that the will of the nation had already made its choice, and that sooner or later the power to be established first in the empire and then in the metropolis would be whatever France wanted. Both of us, however, took every care not to clash foreheads, realizing that it would lead to nothing good, and knowing that it was in our mutual interest to spare each other. The next day I received General Giraud. We conversed in private, undisturbed. What do you propose? I asked him. He outlined to me his plan, which was in fact the plan of Roosevelt and Churchill. The three of us would be in charge. He would be first, I would be second, and the third would be General Georges, followed by the British into France. So as not to upset the balance, I shall be given the rank of General of the Army. But Giraud will retain full charge of military affairs. He will be appointed Commander-in-Chief of French forces, including the forces of Free France and armed groups of the resistance, and as such will depend on Eisenhower alone. The proconsuls would remain in their original positions. Berger alone would probably be removed. Some kind of imperial council composed of Catrux or perhaps Iboué, as well as a few secretaries, would coordinate the administration of the various territories of the empire, without, however, taking any political action. Giraud's proposal was unacceptable to me. What you have outlined here, I told him, realistically means to assign you power under the patronage of Roosevelt and surrounded by more or less imposing statists. It is essentially the same consulate, only placed at the mercy of foreigners. But Bonaparte, the first consul in matters of war and independence, had the almost unanimous support of the people. And what plebiscite can you take? If, say, you do succeed in holding one, will it favour you? Bonaparte, moreover, was the man who, as a leader, brought France victories and conquered vast territories. I hope with all my heart that you will achieve the same, but where are they now, your triumphs? I should add that the first consul also shone in the legislative and administrative spheres. Do you possess the same ability? Besides, you cannot but know that French public opinion now condemns Vichy. But you got the reins of power first from Darlan, then from Nogues, Boysson, Chatelain, Berger. You got power in the name of the Marshal. Everyone knows your letter to Pétain, in which you give him your word never to do anything contrary to his policy. Do you really think that under these conditions you will be able to obtain from the French people the sympathy without which any government will be a mere fiction, unless it becomes the target of revolution? Finally, under the conditions of dependence on the Anglo-Americans, to which the artificial nature of your powers condemns you, how will you be able to preserve the sovereignty of France?